Good morning and welcome to Ask the Experts. This is an educational webinar series hosted by Hospice of Southern Maine, where we talk about hospice-related topics. And today we're so excited to have members of our grief and bereavement team here to answer some questions. We know that, well, let me first say I'm Kimberly Mann. I'm one of the community liaisons here at Hospice of Southern Maine. And to my right,
I'm Kelly Blanchette, the Bereavement Services Manager.
And I'm Maria McCann, one of the bereavement counselors here.
So we're really happy to have both Maria and Kelly here to answer questions that were submitted when you registered. We're also going to take questions in the chat. We'll try. If not, we'll get back to you later with answers. But grief is hard. Grief is a complicated process, and it travels different paths. And we know it's certainly hard for caregivers who are doing the really difficult work of caring for a loved one who is dying. And all of the emotions and physical work of that role, and then to compound it with grief, we know that it makes it an even more difficult journey. And so we want people to know that we're here to try and support you with some education around the topic, and say reach out and ask for help when you need it. Because a lot of things I'm sure aren't as difficult or scary as you might think they are. So always asking is a great place to start. So we're going to just start right in with some questions that were submitted and get the conversation going. So a question was submitted about the once accepted stages of grief. And that used to be the process that people followed and the thinking about it. And the question is anything new or what is different about that, the stages of grief?
Yeah. So I think we're still in a place today where when people hear the word grief, they often think of that 5-stage model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I think something important that we can do today is to kind of deconstruct that a little bit and talk about how when she originally created that 5-stage model, it was actually based on her work with people with terminal illness and not with their bereaved loved ones. So actually later in her life, she did express some regret around the misunderstanding of that, and that grief is definitely not a linear process. So there are lots of new, kind of more modern models and theories of grief. We won't have time to kind of dive into all of those today. We can kind of sum it up by saying that we know that grief tends to be kind of more messy and chaotic. It doesn't, certainly doesn't fit into a kind of neat and tidy 5-stage model. The general idea of all these more modern models is to, number one, be able to accept the reality of the loss. 2, to be able to process through the pain and the emotions of that loss. And 3, be able to kind of reintegrate into life with grief. So that it doesn't necessarily kind of end, but that we find a way to kind of go through life with grief.
But that's not really like it used to be, where we would say, oh, I'm in stage 1, I'm in stage 2, and when am I going to get to the next stage? Because I really want to get to the end. It's more looking for those signs of what you're dealing with at the time.
Yeah, just lots of bouncing around. Yeah. So just because you're in one place today or for, this week doesn't mean,
right. You can't go back and that
exactly.
place where you were at.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria. We received several similar questions, including suggestions for working with long-term grief. And does grief ever end?
Yeah, so similar to what we were just talking about, grief doesn't necessarily end. We don't have this sort of finish line where we're suddenly sort of free of grief. A lot of people are under the assumption that maybe after a year of grieving, they'll be sort of, again, kind of done with grief. They'll reach day 366 and be sort of free of feelings of grief. We know that is not the case. Grief does tend to change though. It shifts, it evolves. The goal of it is to become more manageable, less acutely painful, less intense. And again, to be able to kind of live alongside the grief while it is still there and present with us. There will likely always be kind of moments, days where we might be reminded of something and feel grief on some level.
And perhaps just as strongly as that
Yeah, there
first
may be those kind of
experience, right?
surges, definitely.
Yeah.
So I guess with that said, I think we're all grieving long term because it doesn't necessarily end. I think just to address kind of long term grief in the context of grief impacting your ability to function day to day. If you're finding, long periods of time are passing where your ability to function, get out of bed in the morning, take care of your physical self, sleeping, eating, again, just taking care of those basic needs. If those are being disrupted on a long-term basis, then that's something we would definitely encourage you to talk with your PCP about and seek therapy or professional support in that.
That's a good sign to look for, right?
Yeah.
Another question, how do we reorient that pattern of life when we are so long focused on being a full-time caregiver to an individual and then go without caregiving responsibilities and make those changes?
It's a hard transition. With any kind of significant loss, whether or not somebody was a direct caregiver, there can be a struggle to figure out who you are now without that person and who you are now with changed roles. And when you're a caregiver as well, it's normal to wonder, what's my purpose? What am I doing? All this time and attention and energy was devoted to taking care of this person. Oftentimes when somebody is providing that direct care, they also don't have time or the energy to process what's happening. So you may have been stuck in fight or flight mode from the diagnosis or even from when you had a suspicion that something might be wrong. And only after your loved one dies do you have an opportunity to take a breath, to pause, and think about what's happened. So it's normal to have all of that come flooding in at this point. As far as the question itself, how do you transition? It again takes time and patience. It's okay to take some time to just be, to feel all of the feelings that come with grief and kind of explore in your mind what life should look like now or what you want it to look like now. You may find yourself with new priorities, with changing roles within a family, and it does take time for this to settle.
And I think about, especially with disease progressions like Alzheimer's and dementia, these are really long roads. So you can find yourself a caregiver for a decade or longer. And then that transition happens. Whereas other disease progressions or end of life is shorter. So I imagine that can be even more difficult when you've really been doing this for so long.
Absolutely. Caregiving becomes part of your identity. For practicality, because it's what you are doing every minute of the day or close to every minute of the day. And also because you often have to give up other aspects of your life to provide this care. So you lose your person and you also lose this role. So know that it's okay to feel grief around both of those.
What are some ideas for self-care in grief?
We talk about self-care a lot, right? Or we throw that phrase around, but what does it actually mean? I can't tell somebody what they need to do specifically to care for themselves. But I can say that a couple things are needed: patience for yourself, compassion for yourself. I always encourage people to think about what's helped you in times in the past, times of crisis or chaos. What have your coping mechanisms been that may have worked or maybe didn't work, so you can avoid that now? This looks different for everybody. Within the realm of grief, sometimes we talk about this continuum of intuitive grievers to instrumental grievers. With intuitive grievers being very feelings focused, processing through talking about emotions, feeling the emotions, maybe engaging in expressive arts surrounding those feelings. And then on the other side, instrumental grievers who tend to process cognitively and physically. Maybe talking in a support group won't be so helpful, but doing something physical, creating, building something, or talking about the cognitive piece of grief or talking about it in that way. May experience grief physically, maybe in muscle tension or other physical effects. Most people fall somewhere on this scale, on this continuum. Some people do fall one way or the other more closely. And you can think about what your inclination is with that. Do you feel more drawn to talking about those feelings, or maybe more drawn to doing and fixing? That may give you some guidance on what might help you. And again, going back to those coping mechanisms from the past, maybe you're somebody who responds well to physical activity, and that can distract you and help you have the space to process. Or maybe you're somebody who journaling would be helpful for, getting those feelings out. You may find that people within a family grieve differently, and know that just because your grief doesn't look like somebody else's, it doesn't mean that you're grieving wrong. Everybody grieves uniquely. It's important to tend to your grief in a way that makes sense to you. So if you know you're somebody who doesn't like writing or art, you don't have to try that. Maybe you're somebody who wants to escape to the beach and watch the waves roll in and have that time in solitude. That's a great way too. You'll find ways.
Do you find that people express to you that they feel like they're letting their other family members down if they don't want to participate in an activity that works for them? I just find it really interesting how you're talking about do what's right for you, and it might not be right for your other loved one grieving, right?
Absolutely.
I would feel sometimes like, what if I'm disappointing the loved one because that doesn't feel comfortable or good for me?
I think one of the hardest things is to communicate with your family members that this isn't working for me. But it is important to have those conversations and to say what your needs are, and maybe figure out, okay, today this is something that feels really supportive for me, but maybe tomorrow I can engage in this with you to do something that's really supportive for you.
That's great.
Another aspect, sorry, but another aspect I want to address too is spirituality and religion. A lot of people come into grief support wondering where their religion or spiritual beliefs fit in at this time. Some people will feel comforted and protected by their faith, and that's great. And other people will maybe feel conflicted about their beliefs, may feel some anger towards a higher power, or not supported by their spirituality or religious practices. Know that that's okay. It's okay to navigate this conflict, these feelings of not knowing if this is right. Some people may feel more drawn to their religious practices. Keep that in mind too when you're looking at your family members, like you said, as it may look different.
Great, thanks. Another person wrote in and asked, what are some tips for providing grief support from afar? We all know that we're much more spread out as families now, relations in general.
Yeah, definitely. With technology, we have a lot of ways to support from a distance, which is great. Because grief can definitely feel quite isolating. And it can be hard to find ways to support a loved one when you're not there physically to just be with them or give them a hug. So some tips, I say start with the basics, send the card, send the condolence card, whether it's a sympathy card, an email, a letter, an e-card, offering your condolences, letting them know you're thinking about them, you care about them. Don't skip over kind of the basics. I'd say after that, the checking in, which again, we can do from a distance, whether it's by phone or text or email. Checking in and then keep checking in, I think is the important piece here. Not falling on, into that narrative of, wanting to give them space. They didn't specifically ask for space. I think sometimes our own discomfort can get in the way, of distancing ourselves, in this case physically, but maybe kind of emotionally too from people grieving. So again, just continuing to remain present for people. I think, an example is just telling them, I'm going to call you every Monday and Thursday at 9 a.m. for this, extended amount of time. You don't have to pick up the phone if you don't want to. I won't be offended if you don't answer. Please, no pressure. But if you want to talk at 9 a.m. on Monday or Thursday, like I'm gonna reach out. And just kind of have a standing order of that. That's just one example to really give you a concrete way to show up for someone. Other ways, from a distance, we can now send things to people in a matter of 2 days. So bath bombs, candles, tea, journals, soup, whatever it is, just maybe sending them a little something their way. One of my favorites is compiling maybe a handful of stories about their loved one, or maybe some photos that you have that maybe the person has never actually seen themselves before, or maybe they've never heard this story before. That can be such a gift to be able to give someone. If you're feeling really ambitious, you could reach out to several friends and kind of compile, a bunch of stories together and send it to the person, so they sort of have these to look at whenever they'd like to. That's another great way.
I love that, and that makes me think of something that kind of leads into the next question. The next question that was submitted was about, what do I avoid? What are the things I really should try not to say, not to do? And I think when you mentioned that about sending memories, I'm always so concerned of like, oh, this lovely picture pops up in my memories on Facebook, and should I send it off to my friend who had lost that person? Or will that be a trigger? Or is it, so I'm always worried about doing the right thing, and then certainly about what are the things I should avoid saying, or are there things that are more helpful? And I bet you have some things you can tell us about, what are the better choices, right?
Yeah, it can be hard because, as we've talked about, grief is so unique. So what might be triggering for one person, may be really helpful for another person. So I think, trying to be clear about what it is that person is looking for, what they are comfortable with, and kind of following their lead on that. As far as just kind of generally speaking, things that we might want to avoid. Well, first off, there's no perfect answer to this. There's no perfect thing to say. That's nothing we say is gonna alleviate someone's pain instantly, or sort of fix their grief. So with that in mind, taking their lead and avoiding things, we have the category at least. So, at least you had them for 70 years, at least they're no longer suffering. Definitely want to avoid those. This is a more obvious one, but anything along the lines of, you should be over it by now, you should be moving on, anything like that. I, again, really want to avoid that. Another one that's maybe a little less obvious is saying, I know how you feel. Mm-hmm. We don't know exactly how they feel. No two people are going to experience the same grief. Even if they've also experienced a similar loss, it's going to be a unique journey for each of them. And sometimes when we say things like that, it makes it about us. And that's not what we want to do when we're trying to support someone else in grief. A couple others, everything happens for a reason. It was God's will. Oh, yeah. They're in a better place. Things like that. We don't want to assume anyone's sort of understandings of that. And a griever might say, the better place is for them to be here.
When you have a caregiver who has just experienced loss of that person they've been caring for, are there useful written materials or published materials that would benefit them? I imagine there are some ways, some places that they could look.
Oh, definitely. Definitely a ton of books about loss and caregiving and grief. Everyone's gonna have their own preferences around that. We do have a book list here that we give out to people, so maybe that's something we could send to
We can't.
participants after today's session. But a book is definitely a way for people to sort of feel validated in their experience, sort of normalized, and maybe even identify themselves in someone else's story. I mean, a personal favorite of mine that I guess I could plug, The Beauty of What Remains by Steve Leader is one of my favorites. Kelly, I don't know if you have a favorite that comes to mind.
Oh gosh, there's a bunch, but I think Bearing the Unbearable by Joanne Cacciatore is a good one. And then one that's great for just validating everything that grief brings is It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. And I'll add to that too, that grief can make it hard to read. It can be hard to focus on a book. And we also have a list of podcasts that we can send out as well.
That's great.
For people
Sometimes
who,
listening is easier.
right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's great. Moving on, there was a question about anticipatory grief. It's a word that was completely new to me until I kind of stepped into the hospice world. And I've learned so much about it, and it makes so much sense now that I understand it better. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Here in the hospice world, we see anticipatory grief every day. Anticipatory grief begins when somebody knows that a loss will happen, is likely to happen, or maybe you're even scared it will happen. It can be due to knowing that this death is coming. It can also be due to the numerous losses along the way. Particularly when you are caregiving for somebody who has dementia or Alzheimer's disease, you're witnessing loss the whole way, from pre-diagnosis through the death. It's not just the death that causes grief. You often watch your loved one lose skills and functioning. You may lose the way a family works, roles in the family. It's normal to lose the way life is, your plans for the future, how you thought life would be. All of these things cause grief all along the way. Anticipatory grief has many of the same effects of grief: sadness, despair, feeling guilty. It's not uncommon to feel even greater guilt in anticipatory grief when you're grieving a person who's still alive. But please know that this grief is normal. It's okay to have this grief for somebody who's still alive. It's also normal to have increased feelings of exhaustion. Caregiving is exhausting and grieving is exhausting. And when you're doing them both together, that can really wipe you out. One thing that can be surprising to people is that it's normal to have what's called rehearsal of loss. It is normal to picture in your mind what will happen when your significant person dies. What will it look like? How will I feel? What exactly will happen? This is a normal thing to think about. Also want to acknowledge that anticipatory grief, it is a hard word, does not take the place of grief after a loss. So sometimes people think, I did all my grieving before they died, I should be good to go after. And then you can be really surprised when you're grieving just as intensely after. This is normal. We say that a lot, this is normal.
Would you be okay, just given the time, in
Sure.
case the person who has chatted this question has to leave?
I want to get to
Could
it.
we jump in and do this now?
Absolutely.
And then we'll finish the couple
Sure.
more questions we have.
Yeah. So the question is about families finding a balance between maintaining traditions at the holidays, especially, good timing for this, and doing things completely differently. This is a question we do get this time of year. People are thinking about the holidays and should we stick with old traditions? Should we do something totally different? I feel like we say this a lot, but there's no right or wrong here. It can be helpful to come together as a family to talk. What's important to each person? What do you want to try? What do you want to hold on to? It's okay to acknowledge that things look different this year. And it's also important to understand that what you do this year does not have to set the precedent for next year or future years. You don't have to start a new tradition right now that will continue. You can try something and realize that didn't feel so good and not do it again. Or maybe you're trying something new and people like it and you can continue with that. If you have anything to add there.
Yeah, no, that last piece I think is important. There's a lot of pressure around tradition in the holidays and yeah, just because you decide, you know, this year's, we have a plan that feels good for us this year, doesn't mean that that's gonna be what everyone's up for the following year. Just
I
being
like that, being flexible.
Yeah.
You know, understanding that the needs may change, right?
Absolutely.
And actually, this is a great question to lead into what you're gonna talk about next, which is answering the question about how ritual plays a part.
Yeah, absolutely. I will add too that flexibility is important in grief. So even if it's not necessarily what traditions you're carrying on or not doing from year to year, even if you're going into a family holiday event, know that it's okay that if this doesn't feel right, it's okay to step out, maybe take a walk or do something a little bit differently in the moment as well. But as far as the question about
Rituals for recognition.
right, for recognizing grief along the way while you're caregiving, I think the question was about, right?
This one specifically was about rituals for recognition of the grief that comes with dementia.
So again, it is normal to feel grief as you're losing somebody who has dementia or Alzheimer's disease. It's normal with other illnesses too. It just is often longer and you see these more significant changes with dementia. It can be challenging to tend to grief while you're caregiving. You often don't have the time, the energy, the bandwidth to do that. So I hesitate to recommend specific rituals for that, but I do encourage people to take small bits of time for recognizing that grief, giving space for it. Maybe it's taking 3 minutes to step outside and breathe. Maybe it's engaging in a mindfulness exercise for grounding that will take maybe 90 seconds. Maybe it's taking a break and getting a trusted caregiver to come in or talking with your care team about respite and having that happen so that you can take a break if you feel comfortable doing that. Most of all, know that it's normal to be feeling all of this. These feelings are okay to experience and to have.
It must be so hard with dementia too, because there's almost like you're not just grieving the anticipated loss, you're grieving these little losses, which can seem much larger too, as the disease changes and as there's, you know, my loved one can't remember names, now can't do this skill anymore, can't, right? And so those are new, fresh wounds each time. It's gonna feel really difficult. So I like the idea that, you know, to take time to recognize either the piece lost or the person, not just the person, but the piece of the person.
Absolutely, because you do lose them over and over and over again throughout that time.
And also, how can I support someone with dementia who is grieving the loss of a loved one? This is tough.
This is another great question, and it is tough. I want to acknowledge how tough that is. So ordinarily, with people who are functioning cognitively at a cognitive level that they've always been, you know, you want to help people understand. But somebody who does have dementia, Alzheimer's, anything that is affecting them cognitively, they may not be able to remember or process the death in that grief. This doesn't mean that they're not feeling that grief, but they may not be able to remember that. And we don't want to, or we want to avoid constantly telling them that the person died, because that can be re-traumatizing as they experience that shock again and again and again. So it is okay to tell them if they keep asking and keep forgetting what happened. It's okay to say your loved one is safe, your loved one is okay, without going into all the details and explaining the death again.
I don't know if you want to just make a note of the book suggestion or if it's something you're familiar with.
How to Survive the Loss of a Love. That is great, and we'll definitely look for that book.
And this might be also a nice time to mention our library.
We-
Is that a good time?
We do have a lending library here at Hospice of Southern Maine, our administrative building, in our bereavement room. And people are welcome to stop in, take a look, check books out. And we're also available to talk if anybody has further questions. I know we're just running out of time, but we're here. This is what we do. We do offer individual grief counseling for adults, teens, children. Whether or not your loss was through Hospice of Southern Maine, we're able to offer services. We also offer support groups for adults. We actually have 2 groups that will run through the holiday season that begin the end of November, beginning of December. And we have a couple of other events coming up, including a children's grief event on December 7th. This will be a drop-in time for families, whole families, to come in and participate in making a memory ornament, doing other grief-related activities, meet one of our pet therapy dogs, have some hot chocolate, meet other families who are experiencing something similar. And the following week, we'll be having a Grief 101 session that invites people who are newly bereaved within the first 6 months of your loss to come in and learn about grief and, again, meet other people who are going through a similar experience.
You know, like there are grief support groups, there are caregiver support groups. And I think probably both really valuable resources and very connected.
Yes.
Very much connected.
Yes.
I imagine that where's the best place for people to look for updates on dates and events? Would it be our Facebook page? This is Southern Maine, are we posting some of the dates
We are.
there?
We are, absolutely, as well as our website, hospiceofsouthernmaine.org. And you're also welcome to email us at bereavement@hospiceofsouthernmaine.org or reach out to us with our phone number that will be included in the materials we send out to you.
Perfect. Any closing thoughts? Anything else?
I just want to say again that grief is hard. Grief is normal. What you're experiencing is normal, but it is really hard. And this time of year does bring extra challenges. And like Maria said before, the holidays come with a lot of pressure. So please be kind to yourself. Be gentle with yourself, okay? Especially if you are caregiving or have come from caregiving. Just take a breath and have some compassion for you.
Yeah. And know that we're here if you need us as a support to the community in general. Please reach out and don't hesitate to ask for help. So thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and we'll post it later for you to share or watch at another time. And thank you to Kelly and Maria for really helping us kind of think about and break down grief, because it's just such a complicated and tricky subject to navigate, but thanks for kind of answering our questions and pointing us in the direction to find other resources. So thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.